to discuss about the competition policies, first we need to learn about the competitive market, the comparison between competitive market and monopoly regarding the efficiency. So we know that in a competitive market, the efficiency is always maximized. Why? Because of the competition between them. So in this market, every firm is trying to maximize its own profit. So in this type of market, you have to maximize your efficiency to stay in the market. So competitive competitive market always ends in the long run in marginal cost pricing. The price is exactly equal to marginal cost. Not only long run, in the short run you can also find it. But in the long run equilibrium, whenever we see that each firm is operating at the minimum point of its long run average cost curve. So that time we can say it will maximize its efficiency because it is selecting the optimum plant size, it is optimally utilizing the optimum plant size. So we can say perfectly competitive market is the best form of market which maximizes the allocative efficiency in the economy. And one more thing you have to remember, that in a competitive market, each buyer and seller, be it a buyer or be it a seller, everyone constitutes a very small part of the total market share. So nobody can influence the market power. Nobody has the market power, nobody can influence the market because everybody constitutes a very negligible share. But still, there is a debate over we can see there is a debate over the issue. What regarding the social welfare, somebody says perfectly competitive market maximizes social welfare. Somebody says no, monopoly market will maximize social welfare. Remember that perfectly competitive market is known as the best form of market because we can find it that the sum total of producer and consumer surplus, that is maximized in the competitive market. But whenever we are going from a competition to monopoly, we can find out that there is some kind of welfare loss or deadweight loss. On the other hand, if we consider the case of price discrimination, in what we see in the first degree price discrimination, the producer, there is just a transfer of surplus from the hand of the consumers to the hand of the producers. And also in the case of natural monopoly, what we can see that one firm is continuously increasing its production and selling the commodity for each successive unit is sold at lower price. So that means in that case the monopoly market can ensure lower price. At least initially it can ensure the lower price. And as Schumpeter says, that whenever any firm goes for any kind of innovation or technological progress, we can say the reward or the dividend of that innovation or technological progress is known as the monopoly power that the firm can receive. So there is a common convention between the neoclassical economists that the perfectly competitive market is the best form because it ensures the optimization of social welfare through maximum efficiency. So it will maximize the allocative efficiency in the market and also the social welfare. Just at the opposite, monopoly is considered to be a bad form of market or worse compared to the perfect competition or perfectly competitive market. As per the neoclassical theory of firms, the monopolist enjoys some kind of market power. So by utilizing the market power, monopolist can manipulate the price, and the marginal cost pricing rule is not followed under monopoly. To be precise, the equilibrium price is always greater than the marginal cost. So the marginal cost pricing is not followed, and here as per the neoclassical economist, monopoly is a worse form of market if we compare it with perfect competition. But if we consider the modern economics, many of the modern economists, they don't think that monopoly is worse compared to the perfect competition. So as per their convention, we need to check it before reaching any conclusion. So before concluding over which one is better, monopoly or perfect competition, we must go through an analysis of the market structures. Now we compare the case of perfect competition and the case of monopoly. And here we'll also consider the supernormal profit. So let's start with that. The demand function is represented by the demand curve D, and the long run average cost curve, we are considering linear long run average and marginal cost curves. So this is represented by the help of a straight line parallel to the horizontal axis. Now, what is the competitive equilibrium? The competitive equilibrium will be determined by the intersection of long run average cost curve and demand curve. So EC is the long run equilibrium point of the competitive market. So price equals to OPC, average cost is also equal to OPC. So here we can find that the whenever price equals to average cost, then total revenue will be equal to total cost. So that will be represented by the area of the rectangle OPC EC QC. Now, what about the consumer surplus here? So output level is OQC, D is the demand curve, equilibrium level is EC. So whenever output level is OQC, the willingness to pay by the consumers will be represented by the area of the quadrangle OAECQC. What about the total revenue or total cost of the total expenditure of the consumers? So this will be OQC multiplied by OPC. So area of the rectangle OPC So this triangle AECPC will represent the consumer surplus under perfect competition. Now, let us consider the monopoly market under the same demand and cost situations. So here the average revenue curve is D, demand curve and average revenue curve are the same, and marginal revenue curve is represented by MR. So what will be the equilibrium point? Equilibrium point will be determined at EM, the intersection of long run average cost curve or long run marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve. So equilibrium level of output in monopoly market will be OQM, equilibrium price will be OPM as per the demand curve, and the total revenue will be OPM BQM. So what will be the total cost of production? Average cost is OPC, output level is OQM. So total cost will be OPCEMQM. So we will find that the monopoly firm will enjoy supernormal profit, which is represented by the area of the rectangle PC, PM, BEM. Now, what about the consumer surplus here? The consumer surplus here, output level is OQM, demand curve is D. So the total willingness to pay by the consumers will be represented by the area of the quadrangle OABQM. But what will be the actual payment? Actual payment of the consumers will be OPMBQM. So consumer surplus will be represented by the area of the rectangle ABPM. So now what is the loss in consumer surplus? The total loss in consumer surplus will be represented by the area of the quadrangle. That means difference between consumer surplus under perfect competition and consumer surplus under monopoly. And the difference will be represented by the area of the quadrangle PC, PM, BEC. So this is the total loss in consumer surplus. But out of this consumer surplus, how much the PC, PM, BEM that is transferred towards the hands of the producer whenever the market is transformed from perfect competition to monopoly. So PC, PM, BEM, that is the increase in producer surplus which comes from the hand of the consumers. But the area BEM, EC, this area of this triangle will represent the deadweight loss in the economy. That means for transformation from perfect competition to monopoly, there will be loss of the consumer surplus, which is represented by the area BEMEC, which is neither enjoyed by the consumers nor by the producer. So this is the deadweight loss of the economy or the deadweight loss of monopoly here. Now we consider the case of a complacent monopolist. First, so let us assume the normal demand and marginal revenue functions. So initially we will start with the case that lower long run average and marginal cost. So LSE1 equals to LMC1, that indicates the long run average and marginal cost of the firm. So if it is a competitive market, the equilibrium point of the firm will be EC. So that time what we will see, that revenue equals to cost. So the firm will be enjoying normal profit. And in this case, the consumer surplus will be determined by it will be represented by the area of the triangle AECPC. But if we shift from the case of competition to monopoly, so here the equilibrium point will be E1, and in this case the revenue of the monopolist will be represented by the price will be OP1. So revenue will be OP1 multiplied by equilibrium level of output OQ1. So that will be represented by the area of the rectangle OP1CQ1. And here the monopolist will enjoy supernormal profit to the extent PC P1 CE1. Now let's consider about the deadweight loss. So if output level is OQ1, so the total willingness to pay by the consumers will be represented by the area of the quadrangle OACQ1, and the total expenditure of the consumers will be OP1CQ1. So ACP1 will be the consumer surplus. So now we'll compare about the deadweight loss. Here the total decrease in consumer surplus will be represented by the area of the quadrangle PCP1CEC, and out of this PCP1CE1 goes in the hand of the monopolist in form of supernormal profit. So in this case CE1EC will be the deadweight loss. So we can take the case further to the complacent monopolist, and complacent monopolist means that is protected by any kind of law, by the restriction on the entry of market, maybe the restriction of market entry by other firms. So here the long run average cost is higher. So LSE2 is the long run average cost. So now what will be the equilibrium? Equilibrium point will be E2, and here the price will be OP2, quantity will be OQ2. So monopolist will again enjoy supernormal profit to the extent LP2 BE2. So now if we consider the deadweight loss from shifting from E1 to E2, so what is the deadweight loss? At point P1, the consumer surplus is given as ACP1, and at the equilibrium E2, consumer surplus will be given as will be represented by the area of ABP2. So P1, P2, BC is the loss in consumer surplus due to shift in production, shift in cost, and hence the shift in the equilibrium point. So in this case, P1, P2, BD will be the increase in producer surplus, and hence the deadweight loss will be BDC. But now if we compare between point equilibrium, competitive equilibrium and equilibrium E2, so what will be the deadweight loss? In this case, the decline in consumer surplus will be represented by the area PC, P2, B, PC. So out of which PC, P2, BF is the increase in the out of this PCL E2F is the increase in cost of production, and LP2B E2 is the increase in producer surplus. So here what we see, there is a huge decline in huge deadweight loss. The volume of deadweight loss will be represented by the area of the triangle BFEC. So here we can see that if the farm shifts from competitive farm to monopolist, there will be the deadweight loss to the extent CE1EC, and if there is further increase in cost, the deadweight loss of the complacent due to moving from perfect competition to a protected monopolist, that will be represented by a larger triangle BFEC. So that's how the deadweight loss increases due to inefficiency in production by the monopolist. So now we see if in a case of monopoly, even if the long run is, we have already considered the case of linear long run average cost curve. But if we consider that long run average cost curve is U-shaped, that means it is first diminishing, reaches its minimum point and again increasing. So we will find that in the long run, normally it is found in the long run equilibrium of a monopolist that is achieved at the downward sloping part of the long run average cost curve, because the equilibrium condition of a monopolist is, in long run, even it is the equality of long run marginal cost curve and marginal revenue curve. So even if at the equilibrium point marginal cost curve is below the average cost curve, price is more than marginal cost curve. So we find that the monopoly firm will not have any incentive to reach at the minimum point of the long run average cost curve. That means it is not producing up to the maximum efficient scale. But whenever it is the matter of a perfectly competitive market, competitive firm will always it will always reach at the minimum point of the long run average cost curve. That means it will go for the optimal plant size, and also the optimal plant size is optimally utilized. Second thing, monopoly under perfect competition, what is the equilibrium condition? That is price equals to marginal cost. But whenever we are considering monopoly, the equilibrium condition is marginal cost equals to marginal revenue. So we have already studied at the degree of monopoly power, we find that the price is always greater than marginal cost. So if price is greater than marginal cost, the marginal cost pricing rule is violated. So that means it is a type of allocative inefficiency. So whenever the perfectly competitive market, price is much lower compared to the monopoly market. So definitely under monopoly there will be suboptimal level of consumption also. So this is called allocative inefficiency. Next thing is that whenever we are considering the case of perfectly competitive market, each firm has a threat of being wiped out of the market. So that's why it is called competitive pressure. So due to this competitive pressure, the perfectly competitive farm will always produce at maximum efficient level. So that means perfectly competitive market, a farm will always produce at its maximum or optimum level of production. Not maximum, better to say optimum level of production. But whenever we are considering a monopoly is protected in the market. He has no threat of the competition. A monopolist does not have any threat from the other firms. So they will not bother much about the reaching the optimum level of production. They will try to extract the maximum revenue by utilizing its monopoly power. So that's why finally whenever we are comparing a perfectly competitive market and a monopoly market under the same demand and cost situations, we see that the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus, the sum of total surplus, that means social welfare, is maximized in case of competitive market. But whenever we are considering monopoly, we will definitely find it is subject to suboptimal level of production and also suboptimal level of consumption. So that's why we will find the monopoly market is subject to deadweight loss. Deadweight loss due to suboptimal level of production, deadweight loss due to suboptimal level of consumption. So always competition is perceived to be better than monopoly in this sense, specifically the sense of maximizing the efficiency, maximizing the level of social welfare. So that's why this is the essence of competition policy, that always try to restrict the monopoly power and taking the market structure towards competition, because that will increase the efficiency and that will minimize the deadweight loss. Under an identical situation, there will be no deadweight loss. The welfare level will become maximized. So that's why competition policy always tries to ensure higher degree of competition in the market.